Welcome back to another Blender video. So in this video, we will talk about the settings in Cycles. So we have Cycles selected here. Under devices, we have GPU compute. As we talked about in the last video, if you don't have GPU compute and you have a GPU, a dedicated GPU like an NVIDIA drive, you can either select CUDA or Optics. I personally prefer Optics, so let's continue with Optics. So I have a simple scene set up here. If I go to Render View, we can now play with the settings. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is noise threshold. Noise threshold takes into consideration the number of samples we have here, and if we'll run the render for the number of samples we have until the noise threshold is reached. For example, this one went all the way to 0.01. If I set it to 0.1, it will go all the way to 48, and we just skip all the other samples because the noise threshold is reached. You can go pretty high with the setting, but at the end of the day, it's only the number of samples it's going to reach, which you have set here. So minimum samples is something you don't want to change actually, but if you find your renders acting weirdly and it has a lot of noise, you can actually turn on the minimal samples to some value that it makes sense. 0 means it will figure it out for itself. So these are the viewport settings. If I turn on denoising, we have a bunch of settings. So in default, it may be Optics. In my experience, OpenImage is better for calculating normal maps without a lot of distortion, and Optics is much faster, but there is the problem of having distorted normal maps in some cases. So on the Optics, you will have albedo and normal, and on the OpenImage, you will have more settings like pre-filter and quality, which you can get faster or quality renders. And moving on, the render settings are pretty much the same, but you have an additional setting called time limit. So time limit is basically how long do you want the renderer to run. So if you're on a tight schedule and you want the render to be done in, say, 2 minutes, you can just set it here, say 2M, and you have 2 minutes. If you just drop a value, it's going to be in seconds. So I'm going to go back to 2 minutes here, and same denoising here. So the most important setting when it comes to Cycles is these light path settings. So this tells Cycles how much light that needs to be bounced in the scene. For example, for diffuse, glossy, transmission, volume, transparency. You can hit the slider here and select a default which is inside Blender, or you can add a new preset for yourself. Usually it has default, and default actually works pretty well. As you can see, if I go to full settings, there is not much of a difference, but it gives the opportunity for the renderer to go really high quality if it is needed. Like clamping, indirect, direct, it gives a light a maximum value. For example, if you have a light that is way too bright, you can turn on the direct light to say 10 and it will not go over the value. So caustics, it is for glass caustics. I will put an example here of caustics. And fast GI approximation, it's like a way to make Cycles faster, but sacrificing a lot of quality. This scene is direct light, so it's not much affected by the fast GI approximation, but if you have a scene where the light is bounced over and over on, say, like a white surface, the fast GI approximation will really turn down the quality, and it may look like the Eevee render we did last. And there is transparent, which will turn off and on the transparency of the background. If you render an image, say in a PNG, you will have transparent image if you have this turned on, or you will have the HDRI if you have this turned off. If you turn this on, you will have a setting called transparent glass. So you can just turn it on and you will have a transparent background rather than the transmission that is happening inside it. This is good for making renders which you need to change the background later. And on the memory, you will find use styling. So if you have use styling on, for example, I will say my tiles are 1024 and I hit render here. Oh, sorry. If I hit render here, it will render little blocks one by one until the goal of each sample rate is reached. But generally, if you have a good RAM, if you have a good GPU memory, it's recommended to turn this off because it will actually slower your render. Now, in the final render setting here, you will have a setting called persistent data. If I turn this off and if I hit render, you will find this little calculation that is happening. So if you turn persistent data on, it will only happen on the first render, and on the next bunch of frames it may not happen. But this is highly dependent. If you have something like mesh tessellation, it will have to do it for each scene, and persistent data will not really do a lot of stuff there. So moving on to viewport transformation, you will find AGX, standard, filmic, raw, etc. In my experience, AGX does a really good job, and you will find the contrast settings here if you turn on AGX. Now moving on to the bonus section of this video, on the feature set you will find a setting called experimental. It has a warning icon. It's not going to break your computer right away. So if you're using Blender 5.0, you may not have this setting here. It will be turned on by default. So what is experimental? If you go to the mesh here, go to settings, if you put a subdivision surface, you will have the setting called adaptive subdivisions. If you turn it on, nothing happens. So you will have to go to the shader settings, and under material output, under options, you will find this displacement option here. If you turn it on to displacement and bumps, you will see instantly that the mesh starts to rise here. Let's turn this down, tweak it a little bit, and let's do the same for the other material. Options, displacement and bumps. Again, turn this down a little bit. Now these bumps are totally calculated by this displacement map here, and the mesh is increasing the number of meshes, but it's also giving you a really nice render. So moving on to the settings there, you will find the dicing scale, which is set to 1, but for the viewport it's going to be 8 pixels and the render is going to be 1 pixel. So let's go to the render and see the results. Now note that if you have a lower memory GPU, this may crash. So in that case, you can go back to Blender and turn this value up to say 3 or 10. So here is the final render. Hope you learned something, and see you guys in the next video where we will talk about the shader editor. Until then, have a good one.